At 39, Daniel Carter had exactly $300 left to his name. His construction company had collapsed after losing its biggest contract.
The bank took his equipment.
His employees found other jobs. And for the first time since becoming an adult, Daniel had absolutely no idea what came next. Most people would have used their last $300 to rent a room or buy a used car. Daniel did something that sounded completely insane. He bought an abandoned mining camp. The place had been empty for decades. The houses were falling apart. The streets were covered with weeds. Even the old general store still stood exactly where everyone had left it, as if an entire town had simply walked away one afternoon and never returned. People in the county laughed when they heard what he'd done. There's nothing up there but rotten wood. You just bought yourself a ghost town. You'll spend more hauling away the junk than the place is worth. But one old miner didn't laugh. He simply looked toward the abandoned town hall and quietly said, "If you ever decide to open the mayor's office, make sure you understand why nobody else ever did." Daniel thought the old man was only telling another local legend until a few days later, while cleaning the town hall, he noticed something impossible. The mayor's office wasn't abandoned. It had been carefully locked, almost as if someone had expected another keeper to arrive someday. Before we discover what Daniel found inside that forgotten mining camp, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. What time is it where you are right now? Leave a comment below. I always enjoy seeing how many different places around the world come together to share these stories. If you're listening in the morning, I hope you have a peaceful and wonderful day ahead. If it's evening where you are, I hope this story helps you relax after a long day. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about forgotten towns, hidden family legacies, and ordinary people discovering extraordinary second chances, please subscribe to the channel and join our growing community. Now, let's go back to the day Daniel Carter lost almost everything and unknowingly bought a town that had been waiting decades for someone to remember its story. Daniel Carter sat in the parking lot of the county bank with both hands on the steering wheel, staring at the empty space where his work trailer had been hitched that morning. By noon, the bank had taken the trailer, the cement mixer, 2 saws, 3 ladders, and the last company truck still registered under Carter Construction. At 39, Daniel had built the business from nothing but borrowed tools and long days. He had fixed roofs in winter, poured foundations in August heat, and paid his crew before paying himself whenever money ran short. Then one contract collapsed. Another client delayed payment, and the debts he thought he could outrun finally caught him. The bank officer had been polite. That almost made it worse. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter," she had said, sliding the final paperwork across the desk. "There's nothing more we can extend." Now, all Daniel owned fit inside his old pickup: a duffel bag, a toolbox the bank hadn't claimed, 2 pairs of boots, and $300 folded inside his wallet. He drove to the cheap motel outside town, but when the clerk told him the weekly rate, Daniel walked back out without taking a room. He sat in the truck until evening, calculating numbers that refused to become enough. The next morning, he stopped at the county office to ask about temporary labor. On a corkboard near the entrance, a faded auction notice caught his eye: County Surplus Property Sale. Most listings were small lots, storage sheds, and unusable parcels. Near the bottom was one line printed in plain black ink: Abandoned mining camp. Minimum bid $300. Daniel read it twice. He had heard of the place. Everyone had. An old camp beyond the ridge, empty for decades, too far from the highway for development and too ruined to matter. It was ridiculous. It was also land, buildings, wood, metal, and maybe enough salvage to keep him moving. 2 days later, he stood beneath a white auction tent with farmers, scrap buyers, and curious locals. When the mining camp came up, someone laughed before the officer even finished reading the description. "That place is a ghost town," a man muttered. Another shook his hand. "You'll spend more clearing the road than it's worth." The auction officer, Ben Morris, glanced over the small crowd. "Opening bid, $300. Silence. Daniel felt the folded bills in his pocket. Common sense told him to walk away, but common sense had already left him sleeping in his truck. Slowly, he raised his hand. Ben looked surprised. 300. Any other bids?" No one moved. A woman near the back whispered, "Poor guy just bought rot and snakes." The gavel struck once. "Sold." The deed and keys were handed over in a thin envelope. Ben gave Daniel a sympathetic look. "Hope you know what you're doing." Daniel gave a tired smile. "That makes one of us." By late afternoon, he followed a rough dirt road into the hills. The mining camp appeared slowly between the pines, a crooked row of wooden houses, a boarded general store, a small church, and a narrow town hall with a bell tower leaning slightly against the sky. Weeds covered the main street. Porch steps sagged. Windows stared empty and dark. Yet the place didn't feel destroyed. It felt paused. Daniel parked beside the general store and stepped into the dust. Old nameplates still hung beside several doors. Curtains remained in some windows. A child's rusted wagon sat near a porch, half swallowed by grass. He had expected junk. Instead, he found the outline of lives interrupted. As he walked toward the town hall, an old pickup stopped near the entrance road. A thin man with silver hair climbed out, watching him carefully. "You the one who bought the camp?" Daniel nodded. "Daniel Carter." "Walter Hayes," the man said. "Worked the last mine before it closed." Walter's eyes moved toward the town hall, then to the door marked Mayor's Office. His voice lowered. "You can fix roofs, clear streets, tear out rotten boards if you have to." He paused. "But don't open the mayor's office until you understand this place." Daniel watched Walter drive away until the old pickup disappeared behind the trees. The final warning lingered in the still mountain air. Don't open the mayor's office until you understand this place. He looked back toward the weathered town hall. The faded sign still hung above the entrance, its lettering barely visible beneath years of dust and sun. The building looked no different from the others lining Main Street, yet Walter had spoken about it with quiet respect rather than fear. Daniel decided he could wait. There was plenty of work before worrying about locked doors. He unlocked the general store using one of the keys from the county auction envelope. The front door groaned as it swung inward, releasing the smell of old wood, dust, and dry mountain air. Sunlight filtered through dirty windows onto empty shelves and a long wooden counter. Several canned goods still rested where someone had left them decades earlier, their faded labels almost impossible to read. A cash register remained closed beside the counter. Daniel walked slowly through the room. Nothing looked as though it had been abandoned in panic. Chairs still surrounded a small potbelly stove. A broom leaned against one wall. A calendar hung behind the counter, frozen on the final month before the camp closed. It felt less like a ghost town than a place where everyone expected to return the next morning. He spent the rest of the afternoon sweeping broken glass into piles and opening warped windows to let fresh air inside. The practical work settled his thoughts. Construction had always been easier than worrying. Piece by piece, the old store became less abandoned and more simply neglected.
By evening, he had cleared enough space to unroll his sleeping bag on the second floor, where the former shopkeeper's apartment overlooked Main Street. It wasn't comfortable, but it was dry, and for the first time in several nights, he wasn't sleeping inside his truck. The following morning, Daniel stepped onto the wooden balcony with a mug of instant coffee. Mist drifted slowly through the empty street while sunlight touched the rooftops one by one. The mining camp looked almost peaceful. He grabbed his toolbox and began clearing weeds from the center of Main Street. Every few yards, another small discovery slowed his work. A faded wooden sign still marked the Baker family home. Another identified the Johnson residence. Brass house numbers remained nailed neatly beside several front doors. Someone had cared enough to label every building, and no one had bothered removing them. Around midday, Walter returned carrying a ladder, fresh lumber, and a box of roofing nails. "Thought you might need another pair of hands," he said. Daniel smiled. "I'm not turning down help." Together, they repaired part of the general store porch where several support boards had rotted away. Walter still handled a hammer with surprising confidence, despite his age. They worked comfortably in silence until Daniel finally asked the question that had been waiting since yesterday. Why does every house still have a family name? Walter looked toward the nearest porch. Because nobody ever stopped belonging here. Daniel frowned. Even after they left? Walter nodded once, especially after they left. He didn't explain further. That afternoon, Daniel drove into the nearby town for groceries and fuel. At the small diner near the highway, an elderly waitress recognized the dust on his boots immediately. "You've been up at the old mining camp." Daniel smiled. "News travels fast." "Small counties are like that." She introduced herself as Ruth Miller. When Daniel mentioned he had bought the camp, her eyes softened with memories. "I was born there," she said quietly. Daniel looked surprised. "Really?" Ruth nodded. "My father worked underground. My mother baked pies for every Minor Days festival." She smiled faintly. "The whole street filled with music once a year. Children raced from the church steps to the company office, carrying little paper flags." Daniel tried to picture the empty road filled with laughter. It seemed impossible. "What happened?" Ruth stirred her coffee slowly. "The mine stopped giving." After a long pause, she added, "But the people never stopped caring." Before Daniel could ask another question, another customer called her name, and she excused herself with an apologetic smile. Driving back through the mountains that evening, Daniel found himself imagining the festival Ruth had described. The abandoned houses no longer looked empty. They looked patient. As sunset settled over the camp, he carried groceries into the general store before stepping outside once more. The windows of the old town hall reflected the last orange light of the day. Just as he turned toward the porch, something bright flashed from one upstairs window. Daniel stopped. The reflection hadn't come from broken glass. It had come from inside the building, from the direction of the locked mayor's office. Daniel stood in the middle of Main Street until the last ray of sunlight disappeared from the upstairs window of the town hall. Whatever had reflected the light remained hidden behind dusty glass. He walked toward the building, climbed the weathered front steps, and tried the front door. The main entrance opened easily with one of the county keys. Inside, the air smelled of old pine floors and paper that had rested untouched for decades. A faded American flag stood beside the meeting room, while rows of wooden chairs faced a small platform where the town council had once gathered. Dust covered every surface, yet almost nothing had been disturbed. Daniel climbed the staircase slowly. At the end of the hallway stood a heavy oak door with frosted glass.
The painted letters had faded but were still readable. Mayor's office. He reached for the handle out of instinct before remembering Walter's warning. The knob refused to turn. Unlike every other room he had entered so far, this one remained securely locked. Daniel rested his hand against the old wood for a moment, then stepped away. There was no point forcing a door before understanding why someone had wanted it closed. The following morning, he drove into the county seat to visit the public library. If the mining camp had once been a real community, someone must have recorded its history. The small local history room occupied one quiet corner of the building, its shelves lined with old newspapers, maps, and bound county records. A woman arranging archival boxes looked up with a welcoming smile. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," Daniel replied. "I recently bought the old mining camp." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Then you must be Daniel Carter." He laughed softly. "Does everyone already know?" "News travels quickly around here." She introduced herself as Hannah Brooks, the county librarian responsible for local history. When Daniel explained that he wanted to learn about the camp, she led him towards several shelves filled with large bound ledgers. "Most people only ask about the mine," she said. "You're the first person in years who's asked about the town." Together they searched through newspapers, census books, and council reports dating back decades. The camp had once been a thriving community with nearly 500 residents. There had been school concerts, holiday parades, baseball games, church suppers, and annual Miner Days celebrations exactly as Ruth had remembered. Photographs showed busy streets crowded with families instead of weeds and empty porches. Then, almost without warning, the records became strangely thin. Meeting minutes stopped. Newspaper coverage ended. Population reports disappeared after the final year the mine operated. "It's as though the town simply vanished," Daniel said quietly. Hannah nodded. "That's always puzzled me." She searched another cabinet before returning with a narrow file folder labeled Town Hall. Inside rested several folded blueprints tied with faded string. Carefully spreading them across the table, she revealed the original floor plan of the building. Daniel immediately recognized the council chamber, staircase, and mayor's office. But one detail caught his attention. According to the blueprint, the office contained a records room extending farther back than the exterior wall suggested. "That doesn't look right," he murmured. Hannah leaned closer. The dimensions changed at some point. Were renovations recorded? She checked the file again before shaking her head. Nothing. Daniel thanked her and asked permission to make copies. As the machine hummed quietly beside them, his phone vibrated. Emma. He hesitated before answering. His 16-year-old daughter had spoken to him only briefly since the construction company failed. "Hi," he said. "Mom told me you bought a ghost town," she replied. Daniel smiled, despite himself. "That's one way of describing it." "Dad," her voice softened, "are you okay?" He looked down at the blueprint resting on the copier. "I'm figuring things out." Emma sighed. "You always say that." They spoke for several minutes. She worried about him living alone in abandoned buildings. But beneath her concern, Daniel heard something else. She still wanted him to succeed. Before hanging up, she quietly said, "Just don't disappear, okay?" Daniel promised he wouldn't. Late that afternoon, he returned to the mining camp carrying copies of the town hall blueprint beneath one arm. He spread them across the counter inside the general store and compared them with notes he had made while exploring the building. The measurements still didn't match. According to the original design, the mayor's office should have extended several feet farther than the outside wall allowed.
Someone had changed something after construction, yet no official record explained why. Daniel folded the blueprint carefully and looked through the store window toward the quiet town hall standing across the empty street. Whatever story had disappeared from the county records seemed to have stopped at the same place, behind the locked door of the mayor's office. Daniel folded the copied blueprint carefully and placed it inside a weatherproof folder before locking the general store for the night. The strange measurements of the mayor's office lingered in his thoughts, but he reminded himself that every clue so far had pointed toward patience rather than force. Whatever had happened inside that office decades ago had been important enough for someone to leave the door locked long after the town itself had fallen silent. The next morning, he decided to continue restoring the camp one building at a time. The old general store was clean enough to serve as temporary living quarters. Now his attention turned to the building beside it, a weathered structure with faded lettering still visible above the entrance. General Store. Though the front room had survived remarkably well, the attached storeroom at the back had nearly collapsed beneath years of leaking rainwater. Daniel spent the first hours removing broken shelves, carrying warped boards outside, and stacking anything salvageable against the far wall. The work was familiar. Hammer, pry bar, wheelbarrow. Every repaired corner made the abandoned town feel a little less forgotten. Around midday, Walter arrived carrying replacement hinges and a box of old square-cut nails that matched the originals. "Figured modern hardware wouldn't look right," he said with a grin. Together they rehung one sagging door and reinforced several weak floorboards. As they worked, Daniel uncovered a stack of framed photographs buried beneath a fallen cabinet. He wiped away decades of dust with an old cloth. The first photograph showed Main Street crowded with people. Children waved small flags while miners marched behind a brass band. Another showed booths lined with homemade pies, quilts, and carved wooden toys. A banner stretched across the street reading, "Miner Days Festival." Daniel compared the smiling faces in the pictures with the silent buildings outside. "Hard to believe this is the same town," he said quietly. Walter smiled without looking up from his hammer. "Those were good years." Beneath the photographs rested a thick ledger bound in dark brown leather. Daniel opened it, expecting inventory records. Instead, every page listed family names, grocery purchases, and small handwritten notes beside certain accounts. Paid after payday. Coal delivered during winter. Balance forgiven. The final entries became shorter until only one sentence appeared near the end. All accounts settled before the final meeting. Daniel frowned. Final meeting? Walter stopped hammering. "Let me see." He studied the page silently before handing it back. Folded inside the ledger lay a single envelope addressed simply, "To whoever keeps the records." Daniel opened it carefully. The paper inside had yellowed with age but remained readable. "When the last meeting is called, remember that a town is measured by the people who stand beside one another, not by the ore beneath their feet." He continued reading, "Every debt listed here has been forgiven by agreement of the families involved. Let no one reopen what this community chose to close with kindness." Daniel slowly turned to the final line. Written alone at the bottom of the page were 7 words. "The mayor's office must remain locked." Silence settled across the old store. Even Walter seemed reluctant to speak. Daniel folded the letter carefully and returned it to the ledger. "Everyone keeps telling me not to open that office," he said softly. Walter rested both hands on the workbench. "Because everyone who remembers this place also remembers that last meeting." "What happened there?" Walter looked through the dusty front window toward the town hall across the empty street. For a long moment, he said nothing. Finally, he answered with quiet honesty. I was only a boy. My father came home after the meeting, packed our truck, and told us we'd leave before sunrise. Did he ever explain why? Walter shook his hand. Only that the town had made a promise together. He picked up his toolbox and closed the lid. Some promises are easier to keep than to explain. After Walter left, Daniel remained alone in the store until evening. He placed the ledger, the letter, and the festival photographs neatly inside a cabinet where they would remain safe. As he stepped outside, the setting sun cast long shadows across Main Street. He looked toward the town hall once again. The locked mayor's office no longer felt like a place hiding treasure. It felt like the final page of a story everyone else had agreed not to read until someone understood why it had been written. Daniel locked the general store before sunrise and slipped the brown ledger into his backpack. The letter about the final meeting had answered one question, while raising several more. Whatever promise the townspeople had made together had been important enough to forgive debts, abandon homes, and leave the mayor's office untouched for decades. He could no longer believe the camp had simply failed when the mine closed. Something far more deliberate had happened. That morning, he drove to visit Ruth Miller again. The elderly waitress greeted him warmly before her shift began, inviting him to sit with her in a quiet booth near the window. Daniel carefully laid one of the Minor Days Festival photographs on the table. Ruth smiled the moment she saw it. I remember that year, she said. My father won the drilling contest, and my mother baked 3 apple pies because she thought one wouldn't be enough. Daniel laughed softly. Walter told me everyone left after one final meeting. Ruth's smile slowly faded. She folded her hands together. People remember leaving. They don't always remember why. Daniel showed her the copied letter from the general store ledger. She read it carefully before nodding. Yes, she whispered. That sounds like Mayor Thomas Green. Did you know him? Every child did. Her eyes drifted toward memories only she could see. He wasn't just the mayor. He settled arguments, visited sick miners, and knew every family by name. Daniel waited quietly. The last meeting happened after the mining company announced there was nothing left worth digging. Ruth sighed. Most people expected shouting. Instead, she stopped. Instead, people listened. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Do you remember anything else? Ruth smiled apologetically. I was only 9. Children weren't allowed inside the meeting hall. She looked toward the photograph again. But I remember something my mother said afterward. What was it? A town isn't finished just because the mine is. Daniel thanked her and returned to the camp with those words echoing in his thoughts. During the afternoon, he decided to walk the entire length of Main Street, studying the buildings more carefully than before. Every house still carried its original family nameplate. Every porch faced the road as though waiting for neighbors to pass by again. Near the center of town, he noticed something he had overlooked during previous walks. Small cast-iron street markers stood at several intersections. Most were covered with rust and climbing weeds. Kneeling beside the first one, Daniel brushed away the dirt. A tiny pickaxe had been cast into the metal beneath the street name. Curious. He walked to the next marker. This one displayed the same pickaxe but pointed in a different direction. At the third intersection, another marker carried both the pickaxe and a small star. None of them appeared decorative. They looked intentional. Almost like directions. Daniel copied each symbol into his notebook and continued following them through the camp. The markers formed a subtle path along Main Street before turning toward the town hall. One pointed directly at the old flagpole standing in front of the building. Time had left the pole leaning slightly, and tall weeds surrounded its stone base. Daniel fetched a shovel from the general store and began clearing away years of packed soil and grass. Walter arrived just as Daniel uncovered the circular concrete foundation. "Following the old markers?" he asked. Daniel looked up. "You knew about them?" Walter smiled faintly. "Never paid them much attention. We all just walked past them." Together they finished clearing the base of the flagpole. Near one edge, Daniel's shovel struck something solid with a sharp metallic sound. He knelt immediately, using his hands instead of the shovel to remove the remaining dirt. A small iron box appeared beneath the soil. No larger than a lunch pail, its lid had rusted almost completely through, allowing Daniel to lift it without effort. Inside rested only one object: an old brass key attached to a faded leather tag. Though cracked with age, the writing remained legible. "Mayor's office." Daniel stared silently at the key lying in the afternoon sunlight. Walter removed his cap and looked toward the town hall. "Looks like the town finally decided you were ready to find it." Daniel held the brass key carefully in the palm of his hand, while Walter quietly replaced the rusted lid on the small iron box. The faded leather tag still read, "Mayor's office," its lettering softened by decades beneath the flagpole. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Daniel looked toward the town hall standing at the opposite end of the square. Every clue he had followed since buying the mining camp seemed to point toward that single locked door. "Should we try it?" he finally asked. Walter didn't answer immediately. He watched the afternoon breeze move through the weeds along Main Street before speaking. "If the town wanted that key buried beneath the flagpole, they wanted someone to earn it." Daniel slipped the key carefully into his shirt pocket. Together, they walked across the street toward the town hall. Inside, the familiar silence welcomed them once again. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows onto the rows of council chairs. Daniel climbed the staircase slowly, stopping outside the frosted glass door marked "Mayor's office." He took a deep breath before inserting the brass key into the lock. It slid in perfectly. He turned it gently. Nothing happened. He tried again, more carefully this time. The key rotated halfway before stopping with a dull, metallic resistance. The lock refused to release. Daniel stepped back, puzzled. "It's the right key." Walter examined the old lock without touching it. "Maybe it was once." Daniel looked down at the brass key, then back at the heavy lock mounted on the door. It seemed newer than the hinges and handle, though still decades old. He remembered the greenhouse on Eleanor Bennett's farm from a story Ruth had once told him, where an older lock had been hidden beneath a newer one. The thought stayed with him, though he dismissed it as coincidence rather than forcing the mechanism. Daniel pocketed the key again. "If someone changed the lock," he said quietly, "there must be a reason." They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the town hall instead. Several storage rooms opened with ordinary keys from the county envelope. One contained folding tables, election signs, and dusty file cabinets. Another held old maintenance tools and broken lanterns. At the end of a narrow hallway, Daniel unlocked a small records closet. Inside stood empty shelves and several wooden document boxes with their lids removed. Every drawer had been carefully cleaned out years earlier. There were no forgotten files, no hidden maps, no overlooked journals. "Nothing," Daniel murmured. Walter looked around thoughtfully. "Not quite." He pointed toward faint rectangular outlines on the shelves where heavy ledgers had once rested. "Someone took the records on purpose." Daniel nodded. Even the empty room felt organized rather than abandoned. Whatever had been stored here had not disappeared by accident. Late that afternoon, Daniel drove into town carrying photographs of the mayor's office lock, the brass key, and the empty records closet. Hannah Brooks welcomed him back to the local history room. She listened carefully while he described everything they had found beneath the flagpole and inside the town hall. "The key fits," Daniel explained, "but it won't open the office." Hannah frowned slightly. "Let's see if we have any photographs of the building before it closed." They searched through several archival boxes before Hannah carefully removed a large black and white photograph mounted on thick backing. It showed the town hall during minor days, decorated with flags and bunting. Daniel immediately focused on the second-floor entrance. The mayor's office door was clearly visible behind an open hallway window. Hannah placed a magnifying glass over the image. "Look here." Daniel leaned closer. The lock attached to the office door looked much smaller than the one hanging there now. Its shape matched the brass key almost exactly. "That's not the same lock," he said. Hannah slowly nodded. "Someone replaced it after this photograph was taken." Daniel studied the enlarged image for several more moments. The door itself looked unchanged. Only the locking mechanism had been altered. Driving back toward the mining camp beneath the fading evening sky, Daniel replayed every clue in his mind. The buried key had once opened the mayor's office. The records room had been deliberately emptied. The lock had been replaced sometime after the final years shown in the archives. As he climbed the town hall steps once more before dark, he paused outside the office door, running his fingers gently along the weathered wooden frame. He noticed something hidden beneath years of paint near the brass nameplate. A second, much older keyhole had been carefully covered by the newer lock plate, almost as if the original entrance had never been meant to disappear completely. Daniel knelt beside the mayor's office door, brushing decades of dust from the weathered wood with the edge of his sleeve. Beneath the newer lock plate, the outline of an older keyhole was still visible. Someone had carefully covered it instead of removing it entirely. The original entrance had not been destroyed. It had simply been hidden. Walter stood quietly at the end of the hallway, watching Daniel study the door rather than forcing it open. "Your father ever mentioned the lock being changed?" Daniel asked without looking up. Walter shook his head. "No. By the time I was old enough to notice things like that, the office was already closed." Daniel ran his fingers along the brass nameplate one last time before standing. "Then someone wanted future visitors to see the new lock, but not forget the old one." Walter nodded slowly. "Sounds like this town, rather than searching for tools." Daniel closed the office door gently behind him. Every discovery so far had rewarded patience instead of force. If another key existed, the town would eventually reveal where to find it. The following morning, a county vehicle pulled into the mining camp. Ben Morris stepped out carrying a clipboard beneath one arm. He smiled as he looked over the freshly cleared section of Main Street. "You've been busy." Daniel laughed softly. "Keeps me occupied." Ben walked slowly through the center of town, noticing repaired porch steps, trimmed weeds, and the reopened general store. "I'll admit," he said, "the place already looks better than it did at auction." After a brief pause, he added, "I actually came because someone asked whether you'd consider selling." Daniel looked surprised. "Selling already?" "There are developers interested in mountain properties, cabins, vacation rentals, maybe a small resort." Ben spoke politely, without pressure. "If you ever decide this project is too much, you'd probably make a profit." A few weeks earlier, Daniel would have accepted almost any offer. $300 had been everything he owned. Now he looked across the quiet street lined with family nameplates, the church, the general store, and the weathered town hall. "I appreciate it," he said, "but I'm staying." Ben smiled with genuine respect. "Thought you might say that." After the county truck disappeared down the mountain road, Walter arrived carrying 2 old hammers and a box of salvaged nails. The 2 men spent the afternoon repairing loose siding on the church. As they worked side by side, Daniel finally asked the question that had been waiting for days. "What do you remember about Mayor Green?" Walter rested his hammer on the porch railing. "More than I realized." Daniel waited quietly. He wasn't the loudest man in town. Didn't need to be. When people argued, he'd let everyone finish talking before saying anything himself. Walter smiled faintly. Funny thing was, once he finally spoke, folks usually stopped arguing. Daniel drove another nail into place. Did he know the mine would close? Long before most of us. Walter looked toward the mountains beyond the rooftops. "My father said the mayor spent months visiting every family before that final meeting, not telling them what to do, just listening." The afternoon passed in thoughtful silence. As the sun began lowering behind the hills, Daniel carried several old items from the church storage room toward the general store. Among them was a heavy brass handbell mounted to a weathered wooden handle. Dust covered its polished surface, but an engraved plaque remained readable. "Town Meeting Bell." Curious. Daniel turned the bell over while brushing away years of grime. Something rattled faintly inside the hollow wooden handle. He frowned. Bells weren't supposed to rattle. Using the small screwdriver he carried in his pocket, he loosened the tiny brass screw securing the end cap. The worn wooden plug slid free with surprising ease. Daniel tilted the handle downward. A small object slipped into his waiting hand. It was another brass key, smaller than the first, wrapped inside a strip of faded cloth. Unlike the key from beneath the flagpole, this one carried no leather tag. Instead, a tiny engraving decorated the bow. A simple image of the town hall. Daniel stood in the fading light outside the church, the second brass key resting quietly in his palm. Unlike the first key buried beneath the flagpole, this one carried only the small engraving of the town hall. It felt lighter, smoother, as though it had been handled many times before being hidden inside the meeting bell. Walter stared at it for several long seconds before speaking. "That bell rang before every council meeting," he said softly. "If someone hid the key there, they wanted it to stay with the town." Daniel wrapped the key carefully inside the faded cloth again. "Then maybe it's the one we've been looking for." Neither man hurried toward the town hall. Instead, they finished putting the church storage room back in order before locking the doors behind them. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the mountains when they finally crossed Main Street together. The old town hall stood quietly in the evening light, its windows reflecting the first stars beginning to appear above the ridge. Inside, everything remained exactly as Daniel had left it. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight fading from the western windows. The council chamber waited in complete silence. Daniel climbed the staircase slowly, Walter following a few steps behind. Standing once again before the mayor's office, Daniel removed the smaller brass key from its cloth wrapping. He examined the newer lock one final time before looking more closely at the old brass nameplate mounted beside the door. Gently lifting one loose corner with his fingertips, he discovered the plate had been fastened over part of the original hardware. Carefully removing the 2 small screws, he eased the nameplate away from the wood. Beneath it, hidden for decades, rested the original keyhole he had noticed beneath layers of paint. Daniel inserted the smaller brass key. It slid into place effortlessly. He turned it once.
A quiet, metallic click echoed inside the door. Walter drew a slow breath. Daniel rested one hand against the handle and gently pushed. The door opened without resistance. Cool, still air drifted from the room beyond. For more than 40 years, no one had crossed that threshold. Daniel stepped inside carefully. The office looked almost untouched. A large oak desk stood beneath the front windows facing Main Street. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with neatly arranged binders and town reports. A coat still hung from a wooden stand near the entrance. An old map of the mining camp remained pinned above a side cabinet, exactly where someone had left it decades earlier. Dust covered every surface, yet nothing suggested neglect. Instead, everything appeared deliberately preserved. Walter removed his hat as he entered. "Looks like he only stepped out for lunch," he whispered. Daniel walked slowly around the room, afraid to disturb anything. A fountain pen rested beside an ink bottle on the mayor's desk. Several folders had been stacked neatly in one corner. A calendar remained open to the final month before the town closed. Every object seemed frozen in time. The room did not feel abandoned. It felt entrusted. As Daniel reached the back of the office, he noticed another doorway leading into the records room shown on Hannah's blueprint. Unlike the empty storage closet downstairs, this room still contained shelves filled with carefully labeled document boxes. The missing records had never disappeared. They had simply been moved. "Walter," Daniel called quietly. The old miner stepped beside him, his eyes widening. "He saved everything." Daniel nodded silently. Every council record, census book, tax ledger, school report, and community register appeared arranged in perfect order. Nothing had been scattered or forgotten. The history of the town had been protected behind one locked office. Returning to the mayor's desk, Daniel noticed a small wooden box resting in the center blotter. It was no larger than a cigar box, polished smooth by careful hands. Unlike everything else in the room, it held no layer of dust across its lid, as though someone had wiped it clean before locking the office for the final time. Daniel rested both hands gently upon it, but did not lift the lid. He looked toward Walter, who slowly nodded without speaking. Evening light spilled across the old desk as the two men stood quietly inside the office. Every clue buried beneath the streets, hidden inside the meeting bell, and preserved throughout the town, had led them to this single box, waiting patiently on Mayor Thomas Green's desk for the next keeper to open it. Daniel stood silently before the polished wooden box, while the evening light settled across the mayor's office. The room felt strangely alive despite the decades of silence. Nothing appeared abandoned. Every book remained on its shelf. Every folder rested exactly where it had been placed. Even the fountain pen beside the blotter seemed to be waiting for one final signature. Walter removed his cap and quietly stepped toward the window overlooking Main Street. "He wanted someone to find this," he said softly. Daniel nodded. "Just not too soon." He carefully lifted the lid of the wooden box. Inside rested a neatly folded stack of papers tied with blue ribbon. Beneath them lay a small leather-bound journal and a wooden gavel, its handle polished smooth from years of use. Daniel untied the ribbon first. The top document bore a simple, handwritten title: Minutes of the Final Town Meeting. He began reading aloud. Attendance, 143 residents. His voice echoed gently through the quiet office. Meeting called to order by Mayor Thomas Green. The pages recorded no arguments, no accusations, and no panic. Instead, every family had been given the opportunity to speak. Some worried about finding work,
Others feared leaving homes their grandparents had built. Several offered to help elderly neighbors relocate before thinking about themselves. Daniel paused after reading one passage twice. Motion carried unanimously. No family will leave alone. Every household will be assisted until all have reached their new homes safely. Walter quietly smiled. That sounds like them. Daniel turned another page. All debts between residents are forgiven before departure. No neighbor will begin again carrying yesterday's burdens. The words matched the letter he had found inside the general store ledger. The promise had not belonged to one merchant. It had belonged to the entire town. Beneath the meeting minutes rested several personal letters addressed to former residents. Each thanked a family for helping build the community over the years. None discussed money or property. Every one spoke about friendship, sacrifice, and shared responsibility. Daniel unfolded the final letter. It had been written by Mayor Thomas Green in steady, careful handwriting. If you are reading this, then you have opened this office with patience instead of force. That matters. Daniel continued slowly. Many believed our greatest treasure was hidden beneath the mountain. They were mistaken. The ore built our houses, but it never built our town. Walter lowered his eyes as Daniel read on. When the mine closed, several companies offered to purchase the buildings, dismantle the streets, and sell everything that remained. They promised fair prices. Daniel reached the next paragraph. The people voted together. We chose differently. He looked briefly toward Walter before continuing. We agreed that this place should remain standing for however long time allowed, so that one day someone might remember that ordinary families once built an extraordinary community here. Silence filled the room except for Daniel's voice. I have locked this office not to hide records, but to protect the truth. History changes when only profit survives. Let these papers remind whoever comes after us that this town did not fail. It finished its work with dignity. Daniel carefully lowered the letter. None of them spoke for several moments. Finally, Walter broke the silence. People always said the town was abandoned. Daniel looked around the office. It wasn't abandoned. He gently touched the meeting minutes. It was preserved. Hannah Brooks arrived the following afternoon after Daniel telephoned with only a few careful words. She read every document slowly, occasionally wiping away tears before turning another page. When she finished, she closed the journal respectfully. These records are invaluable, she said, not because they're rare, because they tell the complete story. She carefully compared the meeting minutes with county archives. The dates matched perfectly. Only the final chapter had been missing. News quietly spread through the surrounding communities that the mayor's office had finally been opened. Former mining families began visiting once more, walking the streets where parents and grandparents had once lived. Some recognized family names still hanging beside old front doors. Others stood silently in front of the church without saying a word. As evening settled across the mining camp, Daniel unfolded Mayor Green's final letter one last time. Beneath the signature, written in smaller script almost as an afterthought, rested a single sentence he had not noticed before. The next keeper will know this town was never abandoned. Daniel read the final sentence beneath Mayor Green's signature several more times before carefully folding the letter and returning it to the blue ribbon that had protected it for decades. The next keeper will know this town was never abandoned. Standing inside the quiet office, he finally understood why every clue had demanded patience instead of speed. The buried keys, The hidden records, the preserved buildings, and the locked office had never been a treasure hunt. They had been a lesson. Before anyone could inherit the town's story, they first had to learn to respect it. Over the following weeks, Daniel made the easiest decision he had reached since buying the mining camp for $300. He would not dismantle the buildings for salvage. He would not sell the land to developers. Instead, he contacted the County Historical Society and invited Hannah Brooks to help preserve everything exactly as Mayor Green had intended. Together, they spent long days organizing the records inside the mayor's office. Every meeting minute, census ledger, family register, school report, and photograph was carefully cataloged before being placed inside protective archival boxes. Hannah also began scanning each document so future generations could read them without risking damage to the originals. History survives because someone chooses to care for it, she often reminded Daniel. Walter returned almost every morning carrying another forgotten piece of the town's past. One day it was an old street map he had found in his attic. Another day it was photographs of the baseball team that had once played beside the creek. He rarely stayed for lunch, insisting there was always another fence to mend or another porch that deserved attention. Yet Daniel knew the older man had quietly become part of rebuilding the town he thought he had lost forever. Emma visited one weekend, intending to stay only a single afternoon. Instead, she spent hours walking through the houses, carefully copying the names still mounted beside every front door into a notebook. "These shouldn't disappear," she said. Daniel smiled. Neither should the people who lived behind them. By Sunday evening, Emma had already begun matching family names with school records Hannah found in the archives. Before leaving, she looked at her father with a smile he had not seen in years. "Can I come back next weekend?" "I'd like that." Soon those weekends became a routine. Father and daughter worked side by side, recording the stories attached to every building, every photograph, and every surviving document. The conversations they had once struggled to begin now arrived naturally while repairing windows or sweeping old floors. By early autumn, the county officially recognized the mining camp as a local historical site, rather than restoring it into something modern. Daniel focused on preserving its honesty. The general store remained furnished much as it had been left. The church welcomed visitors with handwritten memories gathered from former residents. The mayor's office stayed almost exactly as Daniel had first entered it, with Mayor Green's desk, fountain pen, and meeting papers remaining in their original places. The original letters and council records rested inside a climate-controlled cabinet built into the office wall, while carefully prepared copies allowed visitors to read the final meeting for themselves. One crisp October morning, Ben Morris returned to the camp carrying a small plaque from the county commissioners. He looked around the busy street where volunteers painted porches, children explored the sidewalks, and former residents greeted neighbors they had not seen in decades. "I offered to buy this place back from you once," Ben said with a quiet laugh. Daniel smiled. "You did." Ben looked toward the restored town hall. "I'm glad you said no." Later that afternoon, Walter arrived carrying a narrow wooden box wrapped in an old wool blanket. "Mayor Green gave this to my father after the last meeting," he explained. "He said the next keeper should have it when the time was right." Daniel carefully opened the lid. Inside rested the wooden gavel that had closed the final council meeting, polished smooth by years of careful hands, though another gavel had remained inside the mayor's office display box. Walter smiled gently. "That one was for the records. This one," he placed it into Daniel's hands, "was the one he actually used." Daniel turned it over quietly, noticing tiny marks along the handle, where years of meetings had worn the wood smooth. It felt surprisingly warm despite its age. "Thank you," he whispered. Walter simply nodded. As the sun settled behind the mountains, the old town bell rang once across Main Street for the first time in decades. Daniel had repaired its cracked mounting earlier that morning, and now its clear tone drifted through the valley exactly as it once had before every community gathering. Families stopped walking and listened. Former residents smiled through quiet tears. Children laughed as the sound echoed from the hills. Daniel stood outside the town hall with Emma beside him, watching people fill the same street that had once seemed forgotten forever. When he had spent his last $300 buying the abandoned mining camp, he believed he was purchasing broken buildings and scrap lumber. Instead, he had been entrusted with something far more valuable. Not gold hidden beneath the mountain, not land waiting to be developed, but the memory of neighbors who had chosen kindness over profit, dignity over despair, and community over convenience. Looking back toward the open door of the mayor's office, Daniel realized the town had never been waiting for someone to save it. It had simply been waiting for someone willing to remember why it deserved to be remembered. Late that evening, after the last visitors had left the mining camp, Daniel climbed the stairs to the mayor's office one final time. The old building had become quiet again. Moonlight rested softly across the worn wooden floor. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. He walked to Mayor Thomas Green's desk and carefully unfolded the final letter once more. He had already read it several times. He thought he understood every word. But as he turned the last page over, a smaller sheet of paper slipped from inside the folded letter and drifted onto the desk. Daniel frowned. He was certain it hadn't been there before. He unfolded it carefully. Only a few sentences had been written. "People will one day believe this town disappeared because the mine failed. That will never be true." Daniel continued reading. "A mine builds a paycheck. A community builds a life." His eyes slowly moved to the final paragraphs. "When the company offered to buy every building, they promised each family more money than most of us had ever seen. We could have left nothing behind. Instead, every household voted to leave this place standing, not because these buildings were valuable, but because the people who lived inside them were." Daniel lowered the paper. For weeks he had believed the locked mayor's office protected records. Then he believed it protected history. Now he finally understood. It had protected something much larger. Perspective. If someone opened the office too soon, they would only see abandoned buildings. If someone first walked the empty streets, read the names beside the doors, listened to the stories, met the people who still remembered, only then would those papers mean something. Mayor Green hadn't locked the office to hide the truth. He had locked it until someone had already learned it. Daniel looked through the office window toward Main Street. Children had spent the afternoon running between the old houses. Former residents had stood on porches, sharing stories they hadn't told in decades. The town wasn't alive because the buildings had survived. It was alive because people finally remembered why they mattered. He smiled quietly. $300 had bought him a forgotten mining camp. But that wasn't what he had truly inherited. He had inherited the responsibility to make sure an entire community would never disappear a second time. Daniel carefully folded the final note and placed it beside Mayor Green's original letter. Then he walked to the office door. For a long moment, he looked at the old lock that had remained closed for so many years. He smiled and left the door unlocked, not because the secret was gone, but because the town no longer needed protecting from people. It simply needed someone willing to remember. Some places are built with lumber, some are built with stone, but the strongest towns are built with ordinary people who choose one another. And those places are never truly abandoned, as long as someone still remembers the way home.